We are back with our Endgame series from the Olympiad, and in our next position, if you've seen the first video, you should have an idea of what to do with black here and why. If you haven't seen the first video yet, go back, take a look, and then try to answer the question here. So, we need to make a plan with black. It's black's move. Come up with 3 candidate moves, compare them, and make a decision on what you would play if this was a practical game. If you're a pause your video type of person, now's the time, because this is already a critical position. This is very drawish if you don't make the most out of what you have here. All right, so in this game between Singapore and the United States, Ray Robson with black does find the objective best move here. So in the previous video, I talked about the defensive side of a rook and pawn in game and the types of trades that you're trying to make. That was a 3 versus 2. So now we've got a 4 versus 3 on the king side. If you want to play a move like h5, this is going to slow down progress, and white is going to be able to build the ideal defensive structure. So h5 off the table, rook moves shuffling, like say rook a2, gives white time to play the ideal move with h4. So hopefully by process of elimination now, you're considering the move g5, but why? Good time to ask that question. If white, say I waste a move here and move my rook, if white elects to push a pawn in either case, when the pawns are not together, they control far less squares and they're easier to approach. So they become potential targets. You get more winning chances if you can break the structure of the opponent. So that's why we want to start with this good practical move, g5. And ideally, if we're going to trade, if I'm the aggressor here with black, I want to trade off the rook pawn because that's going to be the least valuable. So that's why we have that theme in chess of capturing towards the center. Typically, it makes the pawn stronger. So as we move forward, white plays h3, good practical move, saying, I don't want you to take more space with g4. But if it's something that the opponent is signaling, and they're a strong opponent in this case, wanted to stop g4. Well, can I get g4 anyway, potentially? Why, yes. So let me go ahead and improve my worst pawn. I've got g4 as a potential move in the future, but there's no reason to rush. King g2, you're improving your king. Why not get our king closer to the action? It is an endgame after all. And now, back to multiple choices here. So we've got rook a2, g4, or h4. Which one do you choose? Again, if you're a pause your video type your person, now's the time. You can consider. If not, let's keep on going. So in this case, we have the highest chance to create weaknesses with the move h4. g4 will very likely allow that ideal defensive structure again for white. h4 now gives white the potential of playing g4, where we could have a pawn break on f5, and that h3 pawn will be weak and our rook can keep an eye on it forever. So white opts to capture on h4. Now this is not an automatic capture. This isn't just my pawn captures back. We talked about it earlier. You want to get rid of the rook pawns. In endgames, they're typically the least valuable pawns, in rook and pawn endgames. Knight endgames, king and pawn endgames, of course, they can be valuable as the outside pass pawn, but here, taking with the rook is best, as the pawns staying together are a lot stronger than when separated, which black has accomplished with white structure. Rook b8, keep an eye on that pass pawn, and white has improved the rook, giving it more active ideas. That is the thing about, as this pawn gets closer, our rook would be the stronger rook. This is why rooks belong behind pass pawns, as the further it's pushed forward, the more squares of activity a rook gets. But as a pawn gets closer to a rook that's in front of the pawn, it loses squares and loses strength. So white chooses to get the rook to a more active square. And now we have a little bit of shuffling. So when your opponent begins to shuffle, this shows that you need to figure out a way to make progress. It's clearly white knows it's best to just sit in this position. Black's going to be required to push the pawns forward, and hopefully I'm able to trade the pawns in a way which can make a draw for me. So I want to improve my king. I want to improve the pawn structure slowly and not get stuck. So let's play a flexible move to start with, f6. The rook hits the e-pawn. Easy to defend. And now, the creation of a pass pawn is where we're going in the long term. So a good practical move to start here, e4. Maybe we find the right moment to play e3. Potentially, if we go rook a2, a very common tactical theme is to push that pawn again, winning the f2 pawn. Just slow improvement. I'm not required to trade off the pawn, but it leaves me flexible with aggressive ideas going forward. So rook c6. So before considering pushing the pawn, I want to optimize. Because as the action takes place, I want my king further up the board with my pawns, so there's a higher chance of a queen. When white is shuffling, this gives you the opportunity to make the most out of your position, making these slow, steady improvements to get the most out of it. So king f5, king e5, don't hang the f-pawn, to play f5, to then finally go king f4. And since white was shuffling, we just make those slow, steady improvements. So now, should we push the pawn or look for a little more in the position? A little bit of shuffling. We protect the f-pawn so our king can potentially move. And it never hurts to shuffle and test to see what your opponent is going to do. We saw it in the first video, and we're seeing it here. You've got the 50 move rule to rely on, and in this type of time control with the 30-second increment, there's really no rush. So it's just kind of checking, all right, what are you going to do with this? What are you going to do with this? Doesn't hurt to test the waters a bit, because every time you push a pawn or have a capture, you're resetting that counter. And you should really be thinking about endgames as, how can I get the most out of this endgame position? And sometimes the best answer is to make moves that do not show the plan immediately, to veil what you're thinking. So Ray shuffled a bit here, and then finally plays rook a2. And it could be maybe the opponent's playing a little bit fast, because, for instance, what if rook d6 versus rook e6 that happened in the game? Well, in the shuffling, the opponent just thought there's no aggressive ideas, but here e3, and we're back to that pawn being pinned. and all of a sudden an equalish position becomes one-sided. So this is why that shuffle takes place that you see in a lot of very high-level games. They're looking for that opportunity. I may not be making a threat every move, but somewhere subtly, you get rook a2, and white notices, okay, no e3. And after this, we see this idea is not going to work, and that's really the only thing you have in the position. So now we're going to change the structure. g4. Keep the pawns together. As I talked about in the previous video, we want to avoid passive defense with the pawn. Notice how in Alice's game, she pushed the g-pawn forward to secure the pawns further up the board. Here, with the pawn on its starting square, we're going to be able to get our pawn to f3, and it's going to be quite annoying as there's going to be multiple threats. So we need to get a little shuffling in to complete our plan. So rook defends the pawn. And careful not to be in too much of a hurry with your plan. It's how games are lost in these types of positions. So again, setting that subtle threat. Does it work here? f4. And after king g1, f3. So we've gotten the ideal setup of our pawns. And the main idea, cutting off all these squares, and with passive defense required. Pause the video and see if you can't see the rest of the game here. Black to play and win. Let's go with the most forcing move, e3. If white doesn't react, e2, rook d2, rook d1. And if f takes e3, first, king g3, check. And here, white resigned, as it's a bit difficult to get out of the following sequence that, if you've done some puzzle rush or endgame tactics, you've likely seen this before. Check. And next move, promotion. So hopefully you're enjoying this endgame series on the Olympiad. If you are, let us know by pressing that like button. And if you wouldn't mind, subscribe to the US Chess channel. Thanks.